Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm with True North, and I am very delighted today to be sitting down with Lindsay Shepherd, who is a True North Investigative Journalism Fellow. Lindsay, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Lindsay and I decided for an interview for over Christmas, we would sit down and make it kind of lighthearted, have a glass of wine, and relax and let the viewer and let the True North Nation get to know Lindsay a little better since she is working with us. Lindsay, are you also doing another fellowship as well?
Yeah, with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I just focus on campus free speech over there.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So for us, Lindsay's doing investigative journalism. She's also working on some longer projects, maybe some speaker series, things that we're going to be rolling out in the new year. So maybe we can get into that a little bit as well in the interview. So I wanted to, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I want to talk to you about today. So in kind of researching, getting ready for this interview, I realized that you and I, we have quite a bit in common. So we both grew up in Vancouver. We both started on the political left and then kind of made a journey over to the right. I think at some point, for me, it was during university. I think for you as well. What else? We both now work for True North, obviously. We're both vegetarian. We both frequently get mischaracterized by our critics online, saying things that are pretty much just not true. And we both are mothers of sons that are almost the same age. Almost the same age. So
1 month apart, right?
Yeah, we're end of February, I think.
End of March.
End of March,
yeah.
Okay. So I think, there's a lot that we can kind of unpack and talk about in that. So I think, everyone knows your story by now. Everyone knows of what happened to you at Wilfrid Laurier. But what about kind of before that? So why don't you talk a little bit about where you grew up, what kind of family you grew up in, and how you came to having sort of a leftist political perspective, which I think is how you described yourself when you were in university.
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Victoria, and my dad lives on the island. My mom lives on the mainland, so in the Vancouver area. I went to elementary school, then to high school. Right after high school, I actually moved out right when I was 17.
Oh, wow.
I moved to Halifax, and I went to Dalhousie
I didn't know
just
that.
for 1 semester. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, I'll move to Montreal. So I went to Concordia University for a year. And then I was like, okay, I just need to like stick to one university and just finish my undergrad. So I went to Simon Fraser, and that's where I got my BA in communication. But otherwise, like, when I look at my identity as a leftist, then it was just it just felt natural. I didn't really have a reason to be a leftist. It was just kind of like that's the default.
Okay, good. I think I was thinking back. It's been a while for me, but I was thinking back to like what it was for me that made me, and to me, I always thought it was sort of the idea of like not equality, but injustice, that there's just like some people who don't have all the privileges in life that for instance, I did when I was growing up. And so you see like, wow, there's people who are homeless in downtown Vancouver. That's so unfair. There's people who, were victims of, racism or discrimination in their life that prevented them from having that kind of comfortable middle class life. And to me, that was like the kind of pulling factor. And I felt like university like really reinforced that. Did you feel like when you were in university that the leftist perspective was really just like enforced into you, or was it something that you felt like you had come to on your own?
I think it was enforced, but also I think what kind of radicalized me was my first year of university. I just kind of spent a lot of time on Tumblr, the social media site Tumblr, and I've actually heard a lot of people say that that's what kind of radicalized them.
On the left?
Yeah, like radical leftism. Yeah, and so I was just constantly following these like social justice blogs, and sometimes I wouldn't initially agree with what they said, but I just figured, oh, like this person is probably right. And I remember thinking to myself, like in my dorm room in like my first month of university, I was like, yeah, we should have open borders. What's the point of borders? And I was just like, yeah. And I had these really cute mukluk boots, which had like faux fur, and like they always got compliments and stuff. But I was like, I have to stop wearing these because these are cultural appropriation. I just have to stop. Yeah, so that's kind of like, that was like the extreme. It was really only the first semester of university, and then I started to mellow out. And by the time I left my undergrad, I was really questioning some of the things I was learning.
Okay, yeah. I mean, for me, like I would say I started out as just like a regular liberal, and then I kind of felt like the logical place to go was towards like Marxism. So I took a course in undergrad called like a critique of Marx and Marxism, And that was just the thing for me that just totally blew up my worldview, because it was like there were so many contradictions, and I would like read the text and I found it was like so intensely laden with like really confusing concepts and words that kind of were like invented, and I would like read it and find contradictions, and I'd take the contradictions to class like kind of excited that I had found a contradiction. And then it was like the class, it was a small seminar, and they like loved the contradictions, so that was like kind of would like feed them, and it would make them like even more devoted in their views, which I just felt like that was like nowhere to go. Like it was just so like negative and like such a kind of sad way to view the world. And I feel like you could see that today with like the kind of extreme leftists, that they're pretty miserable people. Like they don't have a very optimistic worldview. They kind of see like humans as like the enemy or something. And I see that in the environmental movement as well. Okay, so you finished undergrad and you are already kind of questioning your worldview, and then you went to graduate school. And I think by now everyone knows your story of what happened. The thing I always wondered was like, I mean, you must have known things were going to go sideways. Like, what gave you the wherewithal to decide to record your professors? Like, I was trying to think if I was in that situation, I don't even think I would have considered it. You know, to me, it was like, okay, wow, Lindsay's going to make a great investigative journalism because she has that instinct that she wants to like have the truth and, you know, try to expose someone who's doing something wrong. But like, what was going through your head at that time?
Yeah, no, exactly. It was like pure instinct. Like I can't really explain it, but when I first got the email from Professor Rambukkana, who was my supervising professor for the course I was TAing at the time, it said, you know, we need to have a meeting. The meeting is going to be in like less than 24 hours. It was scheduled for the next afternoon. And there's going to be an official from the Diversity and Equity Office there. And that was really the trigger word, right? Was like me, I have to see someone from the Diversity Equity Office. Like I'm really not the kind of person that needs that intervention. Like this is just really strange. So to protect myself, I'm going to record this meeting.
And when you showed the clip of Peterson in the first place, did you know that that was going to be like controversial? Like, did you see him at the time as being like a kind of right-wing figure?
No, not as a right-wing figure. Like I knew he was wrapped up in some controversy because when I first introduced that clip, I asked the class, has anyone here heard of Jordan Peterson? And someone raised his hand and he kind of explained the Peterson issue.
In a fair way or in a... Okay.
No, in a totally fair way. And yeah, some other people in the class, I mean, I had 3 classes that day, but some other people had heard of him but had a more negative perspective. Again, like I just saw my role as the neutral moderator, which I later learned is it's very unacceptable to be neutral.
Right. And so then after that whole ordeal, would you say that you were already kind of skeptical on the left? Or like what was it that kind of pushed you away? Because I think it was shortly after you recorded a video on YouTube that's like, why I'm leaving the left or something. So when was it that you kind of had that moment of...
So first of all, I feel like you always kind of have a latent like political leaning within you that just kind of needs to come out. But so I would say in my last couple semesters of university, of my undergrad, there were just like, I kind of reflect on these moments, such as I was in a class, it was a 3rd year political science class. This was my very last semester before I would go off to graduate school. And the professor, you know, he was a very like leftist activist. The class was about like global politics, but we learned about feminism, Marxism, that kind of stuff. And I remember him saying, all these stupid racists are so Islamophobic.
Referring to like Canadians or Americans?
I can't really remember.
Okay.
But I remember being like, I put up my hand and I was like, okay, well, Islam is not a race, so we should be able to criticize religion. And he's like, oh yeah, the right wing always says that. And I'm like, no, well, it's a problem on the left too. And then these 2 guys who were like the token conservatives of the class, there was only 2 of them. One of them comes up to me after the class and he's just like, are you a con? And I'm just like, what? He's like, a conservative. Are you a conservative? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And he's just like, oh, okay. And I was like, I can't believe you would think I'm a conservative.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of remember, I was like always pretty outspoken in university and grad school too. And sometimes I'd feel alone in a class if I was debating an issue. And then I'd always have students that came up afterwards that was like, Oh, I totally agree. That was great. It's like, come on, you could have jumped in during the discussion.
Yeah.
But it was like, I felt like the conservatives were always very quiet in my classes. And so you felt like maybe inside you were questioning the left. And then when was it that you kind of finally found the courage to kind of come out and say, you know what, I am a conservative? Because that's, I actually don't know if you, I actually don't, I'll back up. I don't know if you identify as a conservative. I don't know if you've had that moment, but to come out at least say I'm not on the left anymore.
Yeah, so I made a YouTube video in March 2018, I think it was, which now has over 1 million views. And it was my very first YouTube video. So that's kind of cool. But I said, yeah, I'm leaving the left. If you want to call me a right-winger, I don't care. If you want to call me a centrist, I don't care. All I know is I'm not with these leftists anymore. So at the beginning of the Wilfrid Laurier stuff, I was always very upset when people would assume I was a right-winger. So I would see these things like, she's just part of this right-wing plot, and she's like a right-wing plant.
Oh yeah, I remember people were saying Jordan Peterson must have planted you to test his theory or whatever.
And so I put out a tweet, and I was like, I am not a right-winger, I am a leftist. And I was always very upset when people would call me a right-winger. But now, 2 years later, if someone called me a right-winger, I'd be like, oh, yeah, kind of, on some things, I guess. Yeah.
Do you remember, I know it's hard to kind of go back and dissect what you were thinking at the time, but if someone had accused you of being a right-winger back then, or when that student asked you if you're a con, and your instinct was no, what was it about conservatism or the right that you just didn't like? Do you think that it was sort of the image that is created of the right from academics and university and the press, or was it something specific about what conservatives believe that you were I don't believe that, so I'm not part of them?
Yeah, I think it was an image thing. It was these people are Christian fundamentalists who want to take away women's rights, and they want to take away all of our rights. They're only for the billionaires, stuff like that, right?
I think that's still the view that a lot of people have.
Oh, absolutely.
Of the right. And I think that's part of the biggest problem that conservatives have, is that they have an image problem. It's all that stuff that you say, I don't think that that's an accurate depiction of the conservative movement or the political right, but the accusations, and a lot of them are much, much worse, that you are a racist, you are a xenophobe. The ideas kind of get taken out of context a little. It's not an intellectually honest debate or level playing field. Because I remember I had the same thoughts about the left or about the right when I was in university as well. Okay, so let's move on a little. I know that I said, you and I both get mischaracterized by our opponents. For me, it's usually these weak men who love to go after True North and love to go after me. An example, just recently, there was a news story in Yahoo News about us and about True North, and they categorized us as a far-right website. And I don't think that there's any political environment where we would be described as far-right. That's just not really what we do. So I just quickly wrote to the editor and said, hey, look, we're a conservative outlet. We're producing news that's objective, and then our editorial bent is a little bit more on the conservative side, but I wouldn't say that's far right. It's not fair. And I was actually quite impressed. Right away they made the change and fixed it, which I think, as long as you go right to it, that they'll feel embarrassed and they'll make the change, at least in that scenario. And I know you had a similar incident. I think it was with the National Observer.
That's right. Yeah. So Fatima Saeed, one of the reporters with them, I guess she used to be with the National Observer, she was talking about the PPC and how one of their candidates brought me up at a rally. So she described me as...
Wait, when you say brought you up, sorry, just to clarify, brought you on stage or just mentioned you?
Just mentioned me, yeah. So one of the candidates mentioned that this was David Haskell from Laurier, he's a professor. He just mentioned he defended me. So he said my name, and then Fatima Saeed wrote in the article, he brought up notorious white supremacist, Lindsay Shepherd. And I hadn't even seen this, and someone brought it to my attention. And then I wrote to them, because usually these, accusations of far-right white nationalists, it's unfortunate, but they do kind of start to roll off you. It's just kind of okay, you don't get it. I'm not even going to try. When it comes to anonymous Twitter accounts, right? But I thought this is in print, in a pretty reputable news site, at least among leftists, right? So I need to do something about this. And so, yeah, I emailed them, and they did change it. They changed it to free speech activist. They tried to still make me look bad, but they did change it, which was good because you can't get away with that. I mean, like I wrote an article recently for True North, and it was about a plaque of Cecil Rhodes School being taken down in Vancouver, BC, and they described Cecil Rhodes, like in all these news stories, as a notorious racist. And it's like, really? So I'm like also a notorious white supremacist. I'm on the same level as like a 19th century imperial, like exploitative, I don't know, guy, right?
Well, and the unfortunate thing with the whole, removal of statues is that usually the reason that we commemorate someone is not because of the racist views that they held. It's usually because they accomplished something, they did something great at the time. And so it's kind of sad that we're imposing our views of today and standards of today onto them. But I think it's really important what you did was just not let them get away with it. And it's exactly the same. Like, to me, it's like they describe terrorists and people who shoot up mosques as being far right. So then if you're also allowing that term to apply to like an organization like True North, it's like, you could forgive someone for being confused. It's like you're putting us on the same table, the same level.
I think it's deliberate.
Yeah.
I think
it's
it is.
a smear campaign. Yeah. And I think the same thing with you. It's like the fact that you used to be of the left and then you had a kind of change of heart, a change of mind, that makes you like, you create like a vulnerability in the leftist worldview, because it's like, okay, if like someone like Lindsay Shepherd can change, then like maybe other people can. And so they see it as a threat. So they throw like every accusation they have at you.
Yeah, or like another thing they try to do is act like I changed all of my views because leftists were mean to me and like called me out. And it's like, no, that's not why. Like, I think people need to remember, like, I was 22 when all that happened. Like, that's pretty young. I was still in school. Like, you can't always ascribe that to me. You can't always compare me to the 22-year-old I was. And I think also a big reason why I was a leftist was, for environmental reasons. Like you said, I'm a vegetarian, still am. That didn't change because leftists were mean to me or whatever. I still care about like pollution and stopping pollution, animal rights, stuff like that. And so these people who try to say like all my views have changed, well, like not really.
Right.
Like maybe a couple policy positions have shifted, but in general, I don't know, not really.
I mean, I offered to like send you over here in a taxi, and you wanted to take transit instead. So I don't know if that was for environmental reasons, but I thought that was pretty. So you don't drive, you don't
drive.
Okay. And so what was it that made you a vegetarian? How did you? Was it like kind of moral reasons, health reasons?
Yeah, like it's pretty simple actually. Like I always had an aversion to meat. Ever since I kind of once cut into a steak and I saw like the veins in it. And it really grossed me out when I was a kid. But my mom forced me to eat meat when I lived in her house. Yeah, so once I moved out of her house, I just kind of transitioned into vegetarianism.
Okay.
Yeah, a big part of it was watching just a PETA video.
Oh, okay.
Like, the organization PETA.
Yeah.
Like with factory farming, where they're like taking pigs and like slamming their heads against the wall. Like that was just it. Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's something definitely to the idea that some things, like even treatment of animals, inhumane, not necessarily for the animal itself, but like for a human being, it's inhumane for us to like treat another living being that way. For me, I kind of agree, like for me it's the same. Like I always just didn't really like meat. I had aversion to it, and then as soon as I stopped eating it, I felt a lot like healthier. And then I kind of like went into veganism, which I think for me was just a little bit too much. I had a vegan roommate when I was in grad school, and so she was like really big into like how you get the right amount of nutrients and making sure you get protein and stuff. I felt like I learned a lot about that. But then, when I met my husband, he was like a red meat, like steak eating guy, and I was vegan, and like we could never go to restaurants when we were cooking at home. It was just like nothing that we could eat. So we kind of like met halfway in the middle. So we're like pescatarian now, where we eat like seafood and fish and stuff, but then otherwise. But I always thought it was like kind of interesting how that gets associated with the political left. And when I'm at like conservative events, it's usually hard to find vegetarian options, and other conservatives kind of like make fun of me, like how come you don't eat meat? There's something like culturally like about like vegetarianism, and same with environmentalism, which I think is a little unfortunate, because I think caring about the environment shouldn't be a domain that's like solely owned by the left, who I think have like a very catastrophic, alarmist interpretation of what is happening. That's not necessarily helpful to like the planet or whatever.
Yeah, well, I think this is to the detriment of the environmental movement because they are trying to make it kind of like a singular worldview. Like, oh, if you believe in environmental, like being eco-conscious, you also have to believe in like that we have to give the land back to Indigenous people. This is Indigenous people's land. You have to believe that like colonialism has ruined everything, and you have to want to decolonize everything in your daily life. Like it comes with this whole worldview that's imposed on you, and it's like I think you're turning off a lot of people who actually might be sympathetic to your cause.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that a lot of like for instance, in the last election, in some ways you could have viewed it as like a referendum on the carbon tax, because the Liberals, when they introduced it, I thought like, wow, what a stupid policy. It failed when they tried like 10 years ago. They're doing it now. This is like a really, just going to be unpopular. Like no one's going to want to pay a tax on everything. Whereas I think polling shows that Canadians are actually okay with an idea. Not all Canadians, but maybe a plurality or a majority. So I think that a lot of people are, as you say, like open to the idea of doing something to reduce our carbon footprint or whatever, without wanting to go with that drastic kind of far left message.
In the recent election, I went to a local debate just in my riding, and they had this like polling software, where you use your cell phone and you can,
cool.
Yeah, everything shows on screen. And the top election issue in my riding was the environment and climate change. And at the bottom, unfortunately, was immigration.
Really? I think it really depends on the location, because probably you're riding, are you in Burnaby?
Coquitlam.
Okay, because I know like my parents live on the North Shore, but it's a part of the North Shore that's in a riding with Burnaby. And like, again, the main issue, because the pipeline, like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, would go right through Burnaby Mountains. So I feel like it's a local issue for them, whereas if you live, say, in Quebec, where Roxham Road is, where 90% of the illegal border crossers, or in Toronto, where I live, where there's just like a lot of refugees that go and live there, the immigration issue is a lot more in your face, and you might see the impact of kind of illegal immigration, whereas I don't know if you see it in your riding.
I mean, even at Roxham Road, like in that area, they all get paid off, don't they? So maybe they're for it.
Yeah, no, that's like a perfect example of kind of like bribing someone with the taxpayer dollars to like make the issue go away. Okay, so you've been with True North now
since October.
Okay, so a couple months.
Yeah.
And you've already broken some huge stories for us. So why don't we go through a couple of the big stories that you've broken for True North. You recently wrote an article about the Ryerson University Student Union, which was torn apart by a social justice kerfuffle. What was that all about in a nutshell?
Yeah, so the Ryerson student newspaper originally reported this. So there was all these impeachments going on within the student union. Some of them were because of just not working 40 hours a week like they were supposed to. So that one's pretty straightforward. But the vice president marketing, she wanted the president impeached because there was this whole issue. It's kind of hard to sum up quickly, but I'll try.
Take your time.
There was a campus event. A non-Indigenous student sang Colors of the Wind from Pocahontas, and that didn't make the vice president marketing very happy, as she's an Indigenous person. She said she was offended. I think she might have used the word traumatized. So then the student union released a statement just kind of defending what had happened and saying, this wasn't so bad. The statement also said the lady who sang the song was Indigenous to her own country because she was an international student in Canada. So we have to remember that you can be Indigenous in a different country. Anyway, so this did not make the vice president marketing happy. She approached the president and said this is unacceptable. The president got mad at her, and anyway, so.
Just almost petty infighting, but also with the social justice tinge, you don't have to be Indigenous to enjoy a Disney film, or the whole idea I thought with Pocahontas is it sort of makes you more sympathetic to the Indigenous cause. So you would kind of think that a social justice warrior would want that story promoted because it gives the perspective, of someone who is from an Indigenous tribe that loves the earth, that wants to teach all these values that people have. Why do you think that they got so tripped up over this social justice issue?
The student newspaper talked to the VP marketing, over at Ryerson, and she said that song reminded her of other songs that were in Pocahontas, and there was a song called Savages in Pocahontas, I guess. I don't think I've actually seen Pocahontas. And so just like, I guess the song Savages being there was kind of a problem.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I sometimes look at the social justice issue and I just have such a hard time wrapping my head around that. Because like I said, because I spent a little bit of time on the political left, sometimes I can understand where they're coming from when they raise issues, but this one just seems like they're really just trying to get attention or grasping at straws, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, some people's reaction to hearing this kind of story is like, oh, they're just being silly, they're being petty, like, let's just ignore this kind of silliness. And it's like, well, no, you have to realize, like, people are getting impeached over this. Like, this whole student union is kind of, like, infighting because of this. And they're going to have to elect a new student union now. Like, this goes beyond, right? I mean, there's tons of problems with student unions in the first place. So this is just kind of the latest, but it's not so silly and petty when you think, well, now the president's name is in the news for being impeached. Like, you know?
Yeah, that can harm their reputation for years, like having a Google footprint like that. Okay, you just put out a new story about 5 instances in 2019 of things getting renamed. So what was this story about?
Yeah, so I wanted to look at some of the top instances of places being renamed and monuments being torn down in Canada in 2019. So whether that's a street name being renamed or, you know, a building name. And I think the 5 cases showed that there are a variety of reasons why this happens. It's not always because of, you know, leftist activists, right? Like, for example, in Brampton, there's a street called Peter Robertson Boulevard, and part of it was renamed to Guru Nanak Way after the founder of Sikhism. So that's Guru Nanak is the founder of Sikhism. It was his 550th birthday this year, and so they renamed part of a street. And Peter Robertson, who, you know, he's the namesake of the boulevard, he was kind of like, guys, you're setting a precedent by naming a street after a religious figure. But the argument of the city councilors was Brampton has a very large Sikh population, and they're contributing a lot to the country.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a dangerous precedent, though, because what you're kind of doing, I mean, I think it's weird in the first place to have a street named after a mayor who's still living. I think that usually these kind of things happen after the fact. But yeah, I mean, if we're just renaming regions of cities after like whatever the latest dominant group is there, then like 50, 100 years from now, we're basically just going to have these little kind of cultural ghettos where like all the Sikh people live in like one small little area because they want to be around all of the, you know, areas that have been renamed after their leaders, and then you don't really have the kind of integration that Canada prides itself on.
Yeah, and I think like Peter Robertson, he made the point that if a street had been named after like Jesus or some sort of Christian figure, like there probably would have been quite a bit of outcry.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's a good point too, because probably large parts of other populations are Christian and they wouldn't go ahead and do that. Are there any other stories that stand out for True North, or anything that you're excited about working on in 2020?
So hopefully we'll be bringing in some speakers in 2020, which is very exciting. Some of them might be guests we had on the True North podcast that I interviewed. So we've got some really great minds there. Also, I've got some ATIPs on the go, so some access to information and privacy requests. Of course, they take a really long time, and the government always asks for extensions and all that, but hopefully they'll come in soon. But yeah, it's been awesome so far.
Great, yeah, well, we're really excited to have you. Like I said, I think you have that kind of journalist instinct, just, you know, wanting to get to the bottom of things, wanting to explain things, wanting to dig deeper when you see something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we're really pleased to have you as part of the team. So one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about today is, I know you're an avid reader and you read a lot, so I asked you to bring some examples of your favorite books that you read in 2019. So what were your, say, like top 3 books that you read this year?
So I did quite a bit less reading this year just because I had my son, and I'm sure, as you know, your time to read just kind of goes out the window, you know. But I still got the chance to read a couple.
For me, I found that I started reading baby books. Like I was obsessed with
Right.
reading about sleep training and breastfeeding and all this kind of stuff. So I was still reading a lot, but totally not the same kind of books that I would usually read.
True. But so I read The Diversity Delusion by Heather McDonald, The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray, and unrelated, but probably my favorite of this year was Jane Eyre.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice, kind of different pace of reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess Diversity Delusion and Madness of Crowds are both on sort of similar topics of the sort of trying to understand the new left, I would say, and some of the priorities, some of the distractions that they have. Can you kind of like compare the two books, or which should you prefer? Which one do you recommend reading more?
So neither really focused on Canada. So The Diversity Delusion was quite focused on the US. I'm totally on the same page as Heather McDonald that, diversity offices at universities, they're just these like apparatuses. Is that the plural word, apparatuses?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't think it's apparati.
Apparati?
No, I think it's apparatuses.
Okay. They've become these whole things that receive so much money. They have so many staff. And what do they really do? What problem are they really solving? And her conclusion is kind of like, well, they haven't even really proved there's like some sort of systemic racism problem. Like they keep insisting there is one, but like what is really showing for it? She also talks a lot about like sexual assault rates on campus and like #MeToo and Title IX, which is like an American thing.
American, yeah.
Can you explain Title IX? Or not?
So I think so. I think Title IX was basically came in under Obama, and the idea was that funding for college sports was linked to setting up these kind of quasi-judicial bodies that would deal with sexual assault allegations. But what they basically became were like these kangaroo courts where there was no due process, where an accusation was basically a conviction, and young men were getting suspended and expelled and having their reputations completely ruined over accusations. And I mean, we all know that, especially for young men and women in college settings, there's a lot of times there's accusations that are not entirely accurate, accusations that come out of sort of revenge or spite, not necessarily fact. There's also a lot of alcohol involved in these kind of events, so the truth is not always easy to discern. So, yeah, my understanding is it's just basically social justice run amok, and actually having the impact to ruin a young man's life without really having the due process that they would deserve.
And with these kind of complaints, even just the complaint hovering over you, let's say it was proven wrong, you're innocent. Even the fact that a complaint was made, it still kind of tarnishes you, because people might still have at the back of their mind like, yeah, maybe you were let off, but what's the real story here? There was still a complaint made against you. So that's what I think, is it still tarnishes you.
Oh, for sure. I mean, look at Jian Ghomeshi. I mean, this is a very high-profile case where I'm sure that he did act in a very inappropriate way in many times, but when it came to the court, he was found innocent. He was not guilty, and he was acquitted of the charges against him. But that didn't save his career or his reputation, because once all the accusations had been made, that was kind of enough. And again, I think that Jian Ghomeshi probably did act in a very inappropriate way, just not in the same way that was described by those who put the allegations against him. But yeah, in so many cases, the allegation is worse than the actual conviction. Okay, and so Madness of Crowds, I guess it takes on a totally different, I mean, this similar theme and the similar idea of like the kind of woke left and how they've run amok, becoming more and more like totalitarian in their beliefs, but not so much focused on universities, focused kind of more broadly.
Yeah, so he covers 4 sections. So he names the sections gay, women, race, and trans, I think. So he goes into those topics, and like I really love Douglas Murray's work. I've read his previous book, The Strange Death of Europe, and that's probably one of my all-time favorite books. This one I found, if you're someone who is like keeping super up to date on Twitter and just like following these cultural issues, this would probably be more of a refresher. Like you've probably already heard of these things, but still it's good to have it all in one place. And I think what stuck out for me about this book was in the trans section, he calls for sympathy and empathy. And I'm completely on board with that. You know, like people who say the word tranny, for example, like I wouldn't use that word because yeah, it alienates people. He talks about like parents who find out they have a trans child and they're just trying to do some research on the internet, find out what's kind of happening here. But then when they see all this like vitriol directed towards trans people, they're just kind of like, whoa, like I'm not on board with these people. Like I'm trying to figure out what's happening with my kid. So he really calls for just level-headedness, which is a good reminder.
Yeah, so I also read both these books, and I feel like if you're someone like me or you who's like so entrenched in the kind of front lines of the cultural wars, everything, like you don't really like learn a lot of new examples or anecdotes. You know them all. But I felt like Douglas Murray just had such a clear way of explaining the issue. The issue, in some ways, when you're in the middle of it, it's so complex and you're trying to interpret and understand this changing world around you. And Douglas Murray has this ability to kind of step back and explain it. You know, yesterday, something that was okay, well, it's no longer appropriate today. And how are you supposed to navigate that? And I agree that the trans section, he kind of starts from intersex and explaining how that's sort of something that has existed across cultures and across time, and that we should start at that point to try to understand how to accommodate people with different sort of circumstances, as opposed to the sort of kind of, I mean, it's just wild the way that the left has sort of created this dichotomy on the trans issue, that if you're critical in any way of a trans person, it's because you hate them and you don't want them to exist as a human being. The latest example was with J.K. Rowling, that she just tweeted that, you know, it's okay to state a biological truth. And, you know, in some ways I read that and I'm like, wow, this must be a cultural turning point, because I think that there's a couple of other examples of just sort of the mainstream tiring of this sort of like far left trope that they push out, and more people kind of speaking out and just saying what everyone thinks. But then you start to read the replies on her tweet and you see like true derangement. And, you know, someone, you do kind of feel for someone. Like someone replied like, you know, I'm trans and I used to read Harry Potter to escape from my life. And I always wondered like what would happen if there was a trans person at Hogwarts. Well,
I saw so many comments like that. I honestly, I don't really sympathize with that. Well, yeah, I think that's kind of like manipulative and like gross. Yeah.
It's crazy. I totally agree that it's like they're kind of saying like, how dare you even question the kind of biological, and exactly, it's so manipulative that you can't feel sympathetic. It's almost just like you just roll your eyes, and it's hard to imagine that so many people are still so sympathetic to that perspective. Do you think the tides are turning, or do you think that we're still kind of in the thick of it?
I think the tides are turning. I'm finding, I've only been involved in these debates for the past, 2 years, but I don't know, from my observation, it's becoming easier to talk about trans issues, and things like when you see Rachel McKinnon, who's a male to female transgender person, winning in women's sports, like specifically in cycling. That's the kind of stuff that happens that makes people think, this has gone too far, or like this is not okay. Like you're clearly different, yet you're entering in women's sports and winning and even setting a world record. Like this is the kind of stuff that happens that changes people's minds. So I think it has become easier to talk about trans issues, while simultaneously it's become harder to talk about immigration issues.
Well, I think immigration is always tough, but I kind of to what we were talking about earlier, that the left has done such a good job of framing the issue. So if you oppose immigration, according to the left, it must be because you hate immigrants. Like it can't be about the rule of law or being against illegal immigration or about being worried about integration. Any of that, I think they're like the legitimate issues you bring up, it's solely because you just don't like people who don't look like you. Yeah. And I think they've kind of done in some ways an effective job of that. Although I find it so silly that when I get that accusation all the time, I just really like laugh at it, because it's so absurd to me. It's such a intellectually lazy argument, and yet sadly you see it all the time.
And now in Canada we have a Minister of Diversity and Inclusion, and youth, but like Minister of Diversity and Inclusion, and like part of the mandate, it's a very vague mandate because again, these diversity inclusion people, they don't really do anything. So like part of the mandate is anti-racism. And so they frame that word in a way of like, of course you have to be an anti-racist because otherwise you're a racist.
Right.
But it's like, no, we know that really anti-racism activism means like open borders, adhering to certain ideologies, celebrating diversity and multiculturalism no matter what, and like you have to be super happy about everything no matter what. Yeah.
Well, even especially about like language and like the idea that we should celebrate people speaking foreign languages and not speaking English or not learning English. I mean, there's, to me, the inclusion and diversity or diversity inclusion office is like a solution in search of a problem. Like there are all these social justice warriors that want like a vocation and profession, and so they created like one out of thin air, where they're busybodies, where you look at the actual mandate, and to me it's like they're promoting division and racism, because there's sort of like a new word that I hadn't really heard much in public policy and public debate until maybe 2 years ago, the idea of someone who's racialized, which I guess just means like someone who's not white, but the idea that like we would create a new category of people that are racialized, like it's like something had happened to them, like they've been like someone has done something to them, they've been racialized, whereas really the only ones that are racializing are these diversity inclusion people who are like obsessed with kind of pushing quotas and pushing division and saying like, no, you're different. Like, you know, you could be an immigrant to Canada who doesn't speak English, who has just as much struggle with integrating and with becoming like comfortable in Canada, who happens to be from a European country, as someone who isn't, right? Like the idea that you can only suffer in any way if you don't have like, if you look a certain way, to me, again, that's like promoting racism, which is kind of what they do.
I have seen some pushback from racialized people against the word racialized, because their point is, okay, well, by using this word, you're still centering white people, because there's white and then there's racialized. There's just everyone else. So
right. Yeah. It's like, what are they actually trying to accomplish by this? It's like making white people feel uncomfortable and making everyone else want to talk about their race. Like, I just don't see any good in pushing conversations where we're forced to talk about something that's, I thought the left's idea was that race was sort of like a social construct and that biologically we're not very different at all. So why is it that, you know, we're so focused on something that's supposed to be superficial and, you know, not something that actually has like internal, as Douglas Murray would say, like hardware. It's a software, not a hardware issue.
Well, I do remember from my classes, they would address this. They'd say, yes, race is a social construct. And I remember the professor saying it. He's like, I know that might be really hard for some of you to hear. Like, this might be totally new to you, but I need you to listen. Race is a social construct. But that doesn't mean that the effects of racism aren't real. So that's how they kind of deal with that.
Okay, but then again, like, I think that a lot of times what happens is that we take historical issues in like other parts of the world and we impose them onto Canada. So you say like, okay, XY people were oppressed in some other part of the world. Canada's a pretty open, accepting country. I don't think we're perfect by any means, but relative to every other country on the planet, I think Canada does a pretty good job. Instead of celebrating that, instead we're like forcing ourselves to like find the worst examples of racism so that we can point to that and make everyone feel lousy.
Yeah, and like a part of this is when you see these racists. So let's take the recent example. There was a woman in Shoppers Drug Mart, and I guess the staff were speaking Mandarin in front of her, and she was telling them to speak English, and she was berating them. She was being way too aggressive, absolutely. I think she might have been cursing too. But people then film these incidents, and there's lots of them.
Always taken out of context, so you never see the full...
Yeah, but I would agree that usually these people are being way too aggressive. They're obviously provoked and they're angry. Obviously, these people are not representative of everyone. These people are probably a little more unhinged. Like the ones who are willing to go on racist rants in public, these are not good representatives of who we are as a country, I don't think. Cool. But they're used as examples of why we're such a terrible country. So.
Yeah, and like just because there's one crazy person doesn't mean that they represent everyone. Like when you see someone, the reason that it's news, the reason it's noteworthy is because it's such an exception. And if you know if you ever interacted with someone like that, you would probably call them out, even if it wasn't your group that they were denigrating. And if that person was like a friend of yours, you probably wouldn't be friends with them if you saw an outburst like that. So I watched an interview that you did. I can't remember who the host was, something like Girl Talk or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And you described something that I kind of only vaguely was aware of, but it was like trad life and how these kind of like very traditional conservative values are like coming back in vogue. Like it's kind of like cool now to be like a stay-at-home mom. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a very small subculture.
Okay.
Mostly, I mean, I've only found out about it through Twitter and YouTube and all that. But we do see it kind of coming out, like, so recently, like, Stefan Molyneux, he tweeted about Taylor Swift turning 30 and her, like, losing her eggs or something like that. And it got a lot of lashback because people are like, why are you worried about her egg count? Like,
and it's kind of like a creepy observation, or like, I don't know, it's like not his business, but anyway.
Right, and like, yeah, why are you worried about her fertility? But yeah, so I wouldn't say he's really in the trad subculture, but there are people who maybe probably describe themselves as right-wing or maybe even far-right, and they just really believe in rigid gender roles. So the man is like the provider, he goes out and works, and the woman is a stay-at-home mom. And that's how she finds her purpose and all that. And I find it interesting. I think there are maybe some lessons to be learned in a society that kind of completely wants to reject gender roles. But at the same time, like, I mean, I consider myself a stay-at-home mom, but also I really enjoy the work that I do, like for True North, right? Like, that keeps me intellectually engaged, especially when we look at how mothers, are they really, like, connected in Canadian society today? I don't know. I mean, you can go to a mom's group or whatever.
Do you do that? Do you have any mom group that you go to?
No.
Online or anything like that?
No. I don't really want to talk about like mom stuff all the time.
Okay.
You know? Yeah. So, and I'm not saying like all moms do that, but I just don't really want to talk about like, oh, my kid did this and my kid did this and my kid's at hockey practice. Like, I just don't really want to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that, so I go to like a mom group and I love it just because it gives me an opportunity for my son to play with other little kids that are around his age, and I feel like it helps him even developmentally. Like, he goes and then we come home and he's like trying to do new things that he hadn't tried before, but he'd obviously seen other kids doing. But I totally get your point that sometimes like it can kind of devolve into just like a bunch of ladies complaining about like things that are really like minuscule or whatever.
Yeah, like I downloaded this app. Called Peanut. Have you heard of it?
No, I haven't.
It's like branded as the Tinder for moms. So like it's to make mom friends. And so I downloaded it for a day. And it's like when you see a mom profile that you like, you can like swipe left or right if you want to like be friends with her. And I just found that like, I don't know if it was just my geographical area, like where I was swiping, but like every single mom was just like, I like reality TV, red wine, and my fur babies as well as my babies. And I was just kind of like, okay, like honestly, I kind of like those things too.
Wait, what is fur babies?
Like dogs and cats.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of like those things too, but you kind of need to differentiate yourself in a profile, you know? So I was just like, okay, I'm going to delete this app. Like,
well, I was going to ask you, like, do people put their kind of parenting philosophy? Because I feel like when you're looking for mom friends, you kind of want to meet other women that might share your ideas about, like, for instance, if you go on a play date, and again, not to judge other people because everyone's different, but like you go to their house and maybe they just like have the TV on and they're serving like sugary snacks or something, and you might be like, oh, okay, that's not really what I want, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like on my profile, what I wrote was, if you like the idea of bringing your kid to drag queen story hour, we probably won't get along. That's what I wrote. And I don't think I had many matches. So.
Did you get like hate messages?
No, no one wanted to be my friend.
They probably didn't understand. Or they were like, wow,
not.
this lady's very political.
Whatever. It was just a trial period.
Yeah. But do you feel like you have like strong views about like how you want to raise your children, or are you kind of more like relaxed and open-minded about it?
I've seen quite a bit of research that says your kid kind of just is who they are. And like, I mean, there are even some studies that say your parenting has barely any influence on that kid. They're just genetically, they are who they're meant to be. And And so I find that interesting.
Kind of like the nurture nature argument that like it doesn't really matter how often you read to your kids, but the fact that you have books in your house says a lot more about like the kind of education levels that you and your family have that will like determine their outcome. I'm kind of like a mix, like it's nurture and nature, but I kind of think to me I try to be like pretty rigid because I think that kids need boundaries and structure and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but like do I adhere to any parenting philosophy? Like no, not really.
It's good. It's good to be open-minded. Well, Lindsay, it's been such a pleasure to sit down and get to know you a little bit better. We're so delighted to have you as a part of our True North organization. We're really excited about all the things that we have planned for 2020. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sitting down and having a glass of wine with me. And hopefully we'll do it again.
Cheers.